All right. Hope that everyone is doing well. Today is a little bit different. It's rare. As a matter of fact, this is the first time I've ever had two things going on the same day. Earlier today, if you didn't catch it, we had a new episode of History Traveler at first episode at the Battle of Little Bighorn. Seems like we've been doing episodes in Europe forever. We're finally back in the United States. So if you didn't catch that episode, uh, yeah, maybe try and pick it up after the stream is done this evening. Got Jocko Willink and Leif Babin from Echelon Front that toured the battlefield with, and some of the other guys from Echelon Front, and they have some great insights. So anyway, hopefully people will enjoy that. But anyway, that's not what we're talking about tonight. This evening we are talking about Masters of the Air, a much anticipated series that just wrapped a few weeks ago. And holy cow, people had some opinions. So we're going to talk about some of those opinions and kind of dissect the show a little bit. Also, we were supposed to do this last week and then had some scheduling issues that came up, really from me. But I would also encourage people to go to World War II TV. Paul Woodage did a whole week of Masters of the Air stuff, and then had kind of a panel discussion that was also really, really good and worth watching. So first, going to bring in Chris from Vlogging Through History, live from his car somewhere.
My sister-in-law's driveway.
All right, it all works. Hey, before we start talking about Masters of the Air, you and I are going to Gettysburg this weekend.
Yep.
You want to give people kind of a rundown of some of the things that are happening this weekend in Gettysburg?
Yeah, so the reason we're going to Gettysburg is they're having the Gettysburg Film Festival, which is super exciting. It's centered around the work of Ken Burns, which Ken Burns is the reason why I got into Civil War history in the first place. And also included in that are Martin Sheen and Sam Waterston. So there's all kinds of events going on the weekend. And specifically, though, JD and I, in addition to being there for those events, we are going to be doing a meetup at the new building that the Gettysburg Museum of History is moving into, a much needed upgrade and facility for him, a bigger space for all of that incredible stuff he's got. And we've got Andy Biggio from The Rifle, and Matt Leach, who portrayed Talbot in Band of Brothers, is going to be there with us. And I think Matt from Addressing Gettysburg as well, right?
Yep.
Nice.
Yep. That's going to be from 2 to 4 on Saturday. We've done some of these meetups at the museum before, but it's just been me, and that's kind of boring. So I'm kind of excited to have some more interesting people who are going to be there for the meetup. And one of the comments that I always hear from people after they visit the museum is, "Man, you guys need some more space." Because there is an incredible amount of artifacts that are there in the museum that Eric has put together over the years, and now we're finally getting an expansion. So this is going to be kind of an open house where people can come and see what the new space is going to look like. I've been talking to Eric, and I'm twisting his arm and seeing if I can get him to put out a few artifacts that maybe been out on display before for people to see. But yeah, you get to come and hang out for a couple hours and see the new space, and kind of see some of the exciting things that are happening there at the museum. So.
And then Sunday we've got I think there might still be a few tickets available at the Adams County Historical Society.
Yeah, last time I talked to Andrew Dalton, there were still a few available.
So that's 1 o'clock on Sunday, and I think eventually that will go up on our channels, but I don't think it's going to be live streamed on the channels.
Correct. Yeah, really looking forward to that. And also, just to add something to that, well, I don't know, Chris, I haven't asked you, but I'm guessing we'll kind of hang out after as well.
Yeah.
So yeah,
that's what I figured. I'm leaving for Italy the next day.
Oh, dang.
Yeah, I'm flying out of Cleveland to go to Italy on that Monday, so it kind of worked out. And yeah, I told my wife that it'd probably be at least 8 or 9 o'clock before I rolled into the house with Eli that night. By the time we stuck around and talked to people afterwards and stuff like that.
All right, cool. So those are some things that are going on this weekend, and also joining us this evening from the channel Real History, we've got Jared Frederick here. Or am I obligated to call you Dr. Frederick now?
If you'd like.
Yeah, so congratulations. You just recently.
Yeah, I think for all the work he's done, he's earned it.
Thank you much. Yes, 2 months ago, almost exactly.
2 months. Okay. All right. So yeah, it's good having somebody with a PhD on that can lend some credibility to our discussion this evening. And I want to talk to you about this a little bit later, but right off the bat, I want to mention that you've got a book that's coming out in May. Is that correct?
That is correct. May 14th, a book entitled Into the Cold Blue is coming out, and I co-authored it with the wonderful gentleman who we see on the screen, and his name is John Homan. He recently turned 100 years old. He flew 34 combat missions in 1944 on two different B-24 Liberators.
Wow.
And so he's still doing mighty fine, especially for being a century old. And he's very excited, as am I, to share his story this spring and summer.
Yeah, I'm really, really excited for that book, especially kind of on the heels of, Masters of the Air and things like that, to get, yet another perspective of one of these guys that fought over there. So as I mentioned there in the beginning, this is a series that had lots of opinions. And Jared, I'll start with you. Maybe we can kind of start a little bit from the get-go. Of course, the series Masters of the Air is based and named after the book Masters of the Air from Donald Miller. And I also want to point out that Jared, in addition to the book and the PhD and everything, had really what I would say is the best post-episode analysis
Thank you.
of Masters
100%.
of the Air. Like, I would get done with an episode, and then I would immediately go to your channel and just get angry that you didn't have something posted yet. So it really added so much to the show. I'm actually going to call Chris out here. This may have been in a group text or something like that. Chris said that he was considering doing the same thing, and then he watched your first episode and said, "No, forget it."
100%. That's exactly what happened. As soon as I saw what he did, I'm like, I'm not even going to try. I'm just going to tell people to go watch his, because he did it so well. And I was the same way. I looked forward to every one of his episodes after each of those episodes.
That's much appreciated.
So Jared, in addition to Masters of the Air, the book by Donald Miller, what other source material that you're aware of was the show pulling from?
I think one of the main sources of inspiration was undoubtedly Harry Crosby's book entitled A Wing and a Prayer. That was a book that came out close to 30 years ago now, and it's really one of the best memoirs about life in the 8th Air Force. And as I mentioned in several of my episodes, some of the dialogue within that book is taken almost verbatim, and you can see it scattered throughout the script. So Crosby is very much, I think, the heart and soul of the book as far as a narrative standpoint goes. For several of these other individuals, they were interviewed, but they may not have written something that was so extensive. And so I see Crosby is really the spine of the narrative.
Well, it kind of makes sense. Well, he's a navigator, so he's kind of in a way navigating us through this show. Were you aware of any other sources that they used?
I haven't had an in-depth conversation with the writer John Orloff yet, although we're working on that for our channel as we speak. And there are a number of other books. There's Ken Lemon's book entitled The Forgotten Man, which
I read that.
a lot of rich perspective on the lives of mechanics and ground crewmen. Um, that was a book that likewise came out late 1990s, if memory serves correctly, and it's very hard to obtain a copy. It was somewhat self-published, and there were only 500 copies printed,
Oh,
all
wow.
of which he signed. So if you're having trouble locating one, that's the reason why. But in the series, of course, as we see here, he's played by Rafferty Law, who's the spitting image of his father, Jude
Yes, he
Law.
is.
I just kept like envisioning Cold Mountain as I was watching this guy walk around the hard stands. Um, so yes, the genes were passed to him very well, I would say. But that is a really great book. And I think it reveals something that's long overdue in our considerations of the 8th Air Force. And that was this Herculean team effort. And my good friend John Homan really struck at this point as I was interviewing him over the course of a year. And he said, "We worked by day, they worked by night, but they worked every bit just as hard as
Mm.
we did."
Yeah.
Because the most consequential thing, the most significant thing of all, was to get as many planes off the ground as possible on any given day.
Mm.
And the pilots weren't the ones responsible for doing that. And so I'm very glad that the mechanics are getting a little bit of love in the series, and I can speak this from a somewhat of a personal perspective as well, because our producer here on Real History, Andy Collins, was an Army mechanic in Iraq well over a decade ago.
Oh, cool.
And he and I used to have many conversations. He was of the mind, no one is ever going to make a movie about a mechanic. But I think this is the closest thing that we're going to get to in that regard.
Yeah,
So
absolutely.
wrenches of the world unite.
So while the series was running, I guess maybe by episode 2 or 3 or 4, somewhere in there, I had ordered Harry Crosby's book, A Wing and a Prayer, off of Amazon, which I'm sure a lot of people did. And I was impressed at how faithful the show was, for the
Mhm.
most part, to the degree that they could, of being faithful to the history.
Yeah.
Like you said, there's some lines that are pulled straight out of the book, and then put right into the show. I'm trying to think of one instance off the top of my head, like little things like the bicycle race that they have in
Mhm.
episode 1 or 2, is something that actually happened.
Yeah, and there's a scene where Crosby is standing naked in front of a mirror at Oxford, and he's trying on the hat, and
Yeah,
that was something he went into in detail in his book, talking about that.
yeah. So, and anybody can answer this. How like, how would you grade the show as far as its faithfulness to the history and realism?
So I'll go first before Jared, because he knows a lot more about that part of things. But I was the same way. I did Harry Crosby's book. I went through it while the series was going, and it was amazing to me how many of those little details were in there, and little incidents that people might have easily thought were made up. Like you have that moment where Clevin has the co-pilot who wants, or he's, I think it's the pilot maybe, wants to make everybody bail out, and he says, no, we're going to stay here and take it. And that was an exact like word for word thing that happened, and it was something that got broadcast for everybody in the crew to hear. And of course Crosby's stuff, things like that. So I feel like they did all of that really well. Obviously, when you're telling a story like that, you have to combine characters, you have to condense narratives, you have to leave stuff out. But I thought they did better than I expected them to
Mhm.
with that stuff.
Well, it's quite the contrast to something like Napoleon,
Mm.
where the creators. I mean, I understand. Like if you watch Memphis Belle, the only thing that really is accurate in Memphis Belle is there was a plane called Memphis Belle, and then it kind of goes wild after that. But with Napoleon, there seemed to be a contempt for historians that you don't see in this show. I don't know, Jared, what are some of your thoughts?
Yes, well, yeah, on that point in regard to Napoleon, in one interview where Ridley Scott was challenged on the historical accuracy, I paraphrase this, but he said something like, "Were you there, mate? Well, if not, F off."
Yeah.
And so that says a lot about how Ridley Scott was approaching the subject matter, and I very much get a sort of 180 perspective when it comes to the likes of John Orloff, because he's very much an individual who did his homework. He acknowledges some of the concessions that
Mhm.
they had to make for all the reasons that Chris just outlined. But I very much see a sincere effort that was undertaken to try to get as much as right as possible and as much as the budget would allow.
Yeah.
We can argue, well, they didn't change the model of the planes, later on. Well, that takes considerable reconfiguration in the world of CGI, and 98 out of 100 viewers aren't going to notice or care anyway. And so there will always be compromises that are made. But I would give it a solid 8 out of 10 in regard to the accuracy, and 9 out of 10 probably for authenticity, material culture, production design. I think that was in a league of its own in regard to how they recreated Thorpe Abbott's, how meticulously they used photographs,
Yeah.
how they went out and found primary source documents to fill and populate these spaces that these characters were going to be living and working in. It was just a monumental effort, and like our friend Paul Woodage on World War II TV, I've had a chance to interview some of the people who were involved, background artists particularly, because
Mhm.
there's a very fun and organic perspective that individuals like that can offer, and sometimes they can also be a little bit more candid. They aren't quite on the PR leash as much as some other higher profile individuals are. So it's really great to get all these perspectives and bring them into conversation with each other.
So I had seen an interview with the actors who played Clevin and yeah, those guys right there.
Egan and
Clevin and
Clinton.
Egan, and they were talking about how when there wasn't as much having to pretend as you might normally do in acting and something like that, because when they were in this mock-up of the B-17, they said the way they had the screens set up around them, they could see the fighters that were coming in from a distance toward them. Like they weren't having to pretend they saw fighters, they actually saw them, and they were being moved around, and they had to learn exactly how to do all the pre-flight checks and all the right buttons to hit, because there were all these different camera angles that they had on them, and so they had to always be doing things in an authentic way. So there was a lot of attention to making sure that even the actors learned what their roles would have been in that scenario. And I really appreciate that they did that.
Jared, did your friend who, I'm sorry, his name escapes me right now, who was in the 8th Air Force that you co-wrote the book with, what's his name again?
John Homan.
John Holman. Okay. Did he have a chance to watch any of these episodes?
Not yet, I believe, but we're going to try to do that for him sometime in the near future. He is aware of it. He's
Okay.
very anxious to see it. And above all else, he is very hopeful that it will encourage people to learn more about the struggles of his comrades.
So, I have a friend who passed away just within the past 2 weeks, named
Mm,
Bud Hedeke.
mm,
He was a bombardier in the 8th Air Force, and I had a chance to sit down and speak with him just about a week and a half before he passed,
mm,
and he had been watching Masters of the Air, and to me, as far as like realism and authenticity and things like that, one of the greatest stamps of approval that you can get is from someone who was actually there and lived it. And I was asking him his opinion on what he thought. He said, "Well, of course, there aren't many B-17s left, so they couldn't fly actual B-17s." He said, "But I think the series has been wonderful, and accurately portrays how scared guys were, and what it was like being attacked, and having to go through flak and everything like that. So that was something that was encouraging to me, is to see someone who actually lived the history, you know, lend some credibility to, the production itself. But now, if you go online, and as a matter of fact, hang on a second, let me find the comment here. I didn't really want to talk about Band of Brothers, but I think we probably should, because invariably this series got compared to Band of Brothers a lot, and the Pacific a little bit as well. And here, the comment says, I could not relate to any of the characters in Masters the same way I did in Band and the Pacific. Do you think it's, and I'm not being critical of anybody who has that opinion. In my own mind, I was making comparisons. Is it fair to compare Masters of the Air to Band of Brothers of the Pacific?
I say no. And this is what I said early on. I get the comparisons are natural because it's the same people making it. But, we don't go around saying, well, you know what, this work of art I just looked at, well, it's not as good as Michelangelo, so it's not good. Band of Brothers is like a once in a lifetime production. We may never see anything that people connect with like that again. And so to compare everything else to that, I think is so unfair, because we're taking like a masterpiece of masterpieces and we're saying, well, it's not as good as that, so it's not good. I felt at the time when the Pacific came out, if the Pacific had come out first, I feel like it would have been received a lot better if it had come out before Band of Brothers. Because of those comparisons, I don't think people gave it a chance to stand on its own. And I feel like people have done the same thing with Masters of the Air.
I was the same way with the Pacific. The first, and to be fair, I still have some issues with the Pacific. I love the production, and and would recommend it to anybody. But there are some things that I would change for sure with the Pacific. But it was an acquired taste. Like I had to watch it a few times before I really had an appreciation for that show. Jared, what do you think? Is it fair to compare this show to Band of Brothers?
In many ways, I would say no. I, by and large, agree with Chris's assessment on that. And for anybody who thinks that they didn't like this show, or the characters didn't resonate with them in the same way that Dick Winters and Lewis Nixon did, I would encourage you to watch it a few more times, because JD, as you said, with the Pacific, for a lot of people, it was a matter of acquired taste, and they had to revisit it a few times before those characters really grew on them. And the reason why that was so is because the narrative was structured differently. There were multiple storylines rather than a single cohesive storyline that followed a single unit. And I think we have to approach Masters of the Air with that same sort of philosophy. And we're going to be revisiting the Pacific on Real History very, very soon.
Good.
And we have an incredibly special guest with a lot of deep personal connections to the story. And viewers will find that out when it comes out. But he too did not like the Pacific when it originally came out. He thought it played loose with the facts that he was intimately familiar with. But only in more recent years did he find himself really attracted to it in a way that he hadn't been before. And so I think the series is undoubtedly going to grow on people as time progresses. And ultimately, it's a different nature of war.
Right.
You can't fairly judge it to Band of Brothers because the experience is entirely different in so many ways.
If you were to
Oh, yeah.
take a radio operator from the Navy on a destroyer and a B-17 bombardier and a Marine who fought in Saipan, and a guy from the 4th Infantry Division who was just a ground pounder, and put them in the same room right after the war and listen to them talk, it would seem like those guys were fighting 4 completely different wars.
Yep.
Like their experience would have been wildly different. And the trip that I went on this past March, where we had, B-17 bombardier, we had a P-47 pilot, we had a medic, and we had a rifleman. And it was interesting watching the guy from the 87th Division, who was a rifleman, and the B-17 bombardier talk with each other. Because even, 78, 79 years later, those two guys had no idea what the other's experience was in the war. Like, they knew that they existed.
Yeah.
But it was completely different experiences. So you take that. Well, yeah, you're going to have a completely different show. And I think some of the producers, or maybe Orloff, said that Masters of the Air is not Band of Brothers in the Sky.
Mm.
And really, we're kind of just focusing on 4 main characters through the show, aren't we?
Yeah, I think that's what Orloff said too. He really intended it just to be those 4. And if we think about it, if you try to apply what happened with the 100th to Band of Brothers, imagine how difficult it would have been for us to connect to the characters if 80% of the guys from Toccoa were gone by the time they got to Market Garden. That's what it was. That's basically what we're trying to do, because most of those guys were gone in the first couple of months. I mean, Harry Crosby talks about that. He says he was one of like 3 officers who were still in the 100th that had flown over there a few months earlier. So the amount of turnover just made that impossible to be able to connect with. And in some ways, maybe that's how it should be. We should realize we can't connect to those guys, because some of those guys couldn't connect to each other, because guys would show up, they'd get their bunks, and the next mission they were gone, and people never even got to know their names sometimes.
Well, with Band of Brothers, it's not too much different, honestly. There are people midway through the series in Band of Brothers who die, and they say their name, and you're like, who was that? And then you go back and you see the series later, and then you see him kind of pop up in those first episodes. Let me ask you guys a question. When you watched Band of Brothers, how did you watch it? What was your first experience watching it, if you remember? It's been a while. For me, I watched it. I got the DVD set, and it came out in 2001. I don't think I watched it till 04, 05, maybe. Yeah, watched it on a DVD set. What about you guys? There's I'm going somewhere with this, by the way.
I missed the initial debut in the fall of 2001, but my family did have an HBO subscription shortly thereafter, and I caught it on a summer rerun in the summer of 2002. And this really dates it, because I recorded them all on a VHS tape.
Nice.
Which my students don't even know existed at this point. And so I wore that pretty well down. And shortly thereafter, as a Christmas gift, I received it on DVD. So I was in high school at the time.
All right,
oh
Chris,
my gosh, you're dating me here, man. I was getting ready to get married when Band of Brothers came out.
Did you watch it on HBO during its initial run?
I watched it on HBO, but not immediately. Like, I think the first episode came out before 9/11, and then like it was right around all of that. I think it was about 4 or 5 episodes in when I picked up on it. So I caught up the first couple episodes, but I think you're hitting on something key there, is that came out before the days of binge watching, when you could just sit down and watch the entire series all at once.
Well, I think here's what I'm getting at, is I think that's how most people watched it for the first time. Matt Leach, who played Floyd Talbot in the show, said that when the series first came out, it was a slow burn. Like it didn't just, drop like a bomb and people were raving about it and everything like that. But where it really, I think where people really started getting into it is when it came out on VHS and DVD. for me personally, I sat there. It took me, I think, 2 days to watch it.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm watching this whole thing as a big collection, like it's one giant 10, 11, 12-hour movie. And I wonder with Masters of the Air, and maybe even Pacific, because it already had the hype behind it and everything, if watching it one episode a week maybe hurt it a little bit. Because those first few episodes were kind of a slow burn.
Yeah.
And something that's interesting that I'll just add to it, and then hear what you guys have to say. I just recently took a group of high school students to France, went to Paris and Normandy, and I told them, hey, and these are kids who have never watched Band of Brothers, didn't even know it existed. So I said, hey, it's on Netflix, go watch it. The response that I got was interesting. I had several who watched the first episode and then reached out and said, I can't watch any more of this. That first episode was so boring. All the guys look the same to me. I don't know who any of them are. I don't know what's going on. It was the exact same things that I was hearing people say about Masters of the Air. Now, once they got into the second and third episode, they kind of started getting into it a little bit more, like a lot of people did with Masters of the Air. So I wonder if we kind of look back on Band of Brothers with a little bit of nostalgia, and we saw it differently than what we experienced Masters of the Air for the first time.
You know, something else that I wonder about too is when Band of Brothers came out, that was, 23 years ago now. We still had a lot of World War II veterans with us. And I think most people who watched Band of Brothers knew some people who had served and maybe even knew some paratroopers. We're at the place now, well, there's so few of them left, and the ones who are left are all like 100 years old or more. Most of this next generation coming up, they're not growing up having known grandparents and uncles who fought in World War II. So I think there's a different level of connection to those events that this next generation doesn't have that we have, or we had.
Decent point. Jared, any other thoughts?
I pretty much agree with that assessment. My grandfathers served in World War II, and they were both gone by the time I was 8. And so I'm kind of in that middle ground, generationally speaking,
Okay.
because I wasn't, for a lot of my childhood, I wasn't old enough to connect with or understand World War II veterans when there were truly millions of them left.
Yeah.
And so that's one thing that has spurred my study, is to get to know that generation a little bit better, since I was often denied the opportunity to meet them during my upbringing. So I think it's a compelling point.
All right, let me ask you guys another question. And before I ask this, I want to preface it. Would it be fair to say that all three of us really enjoyed Masters of the Air?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. All right. So what we're about to say is not detracting from it or taking away or anything like that. But I know with me personally on my own channel, I'm highly critical of almost everything I've ever produced. So with all of that in mind, Masters of the Air, Jared, what do you think? If we could do it over and they gave you the reins and put you in charge and you had unlimited funds, what would you do different with this series?
Oh boy, that's a loaded question. I don't want to step on people's toes if they disagree with me. But I think the inclusion of the Tuskegee Airmen was very admirable from a historical perspective. I think it was the right thing to do. I think it was an important component of the war to convey. I think it was useful in the fact that it showed that there was this broader theater of operation in Europe. Nobody's heard of Operation Dragoon. I mean, hardly anybody's heard of that yet. One could argue it's just as significant, just as large as the Normandy invasion, but it gets overshadowed. So I was very much in favor of the Mediterranean theater getting a little bit of affection and showtime in the series. Cinematically, though, I'm not sure if it is as effective
Mm.
in carrying the storyline because while it was admirable, and this was the first time that Tuskegee Airmen, real Tuskegee Airmen, have been portrayed, all previous cinematic depictions of them have been fictionalized by and large. At the same time, it kind of pulls us away from the men of the 100th Bomb Group to the extent that we really don't see much of D-Day playing out. I don't know. I feel that, and just the oddity of introducing brand new major characters when there's only an episode or two left.
Yeah.
I thought that was a very interesting choice from a narrative standpoint. So I'm torn between historian Jared and cinema Jared over the pros and cons of including the Tuskegee Airmen, especially how late they were introduced into the series.
So when it got to episode 7, after episode 7 finished, I forget who I was talking to, but I said, man, I know I saw the preview and knew that the Tuskegee Airmen were coming in episode 8. And I said, boy, these next 2 episodes are going to get really crowded.
Yeah.
If they're going to, bring in this storyline. And so I'll just kind of bounce off of that. Here was my take on it. Again, this is assuming that you have unlimited funds and you know that the series is going to be a wild success and everything like that. I would, while I love the story of the Tuskegee Airmen and was glad that I see why they brought them in so that people could be made aware of them, because this might be the only shot that people ever hear about the Tuskegee Airmen. I probably would have left out that entire backstory and maybe in the Stalag have the scene where they're bringing them in and then show, hey, there were some African Americans who were fighting and they're introduced here, and then maybe kind of pull a page from the Marvel Cinematic Universe and maybe have a spin-off series about the Tuskegee Airmen, and then like when those guys crash, kind of integrate that back in and maybe bring in the Buckies, for some sort of cameo or something like that. That's just in my perfect world where I can do anything that I want.
I think both of you are hitting on what I think we all agree was a larger issue, which is that the story was already crowded. I think if I were to do anything in budget and time constraints were no issue, I would have made every episode about 20 minutes longer, and I probably would have had maybe 2 or 3 more episodes. It didn't feel like, it felt like there was so much more they could do with what they were already doing. And I think that's one of the major criticisms of trying to shoehorn the Tuskegee Airmen into it, is that you already weren't getting enough time telling the other stories, that now you're trying to do another story that you're not going to be able to do justice for. And I agree. I would love to get a full series like that just on the Tuskegee Airmen, because their story is a great one that needs to be told, and told well like these other ones. I just wish they hadn't done it the way they did it.
To be fair, I think they were running up against 2 things. One is, budget, of course. And then also, people may not know that this series wasn't shot, 6 months ago.
Yeah, it was made during COVID.
It was made during COVID. So I think that kind of hamstrung them a
Yeah.
little bit as well. Jared, you touched on something else with maybe expanding the D-Day story. That was something else that I think I would have liked to have seen, was maybe a little bit more on D-Day. So maybe show Crosby passing out and missing it, but then kind of play it out. We have tons of D-Day documentaries and D-Day movies. One of the things that gets left out of that largely in that narrative is the role of the bomber crews.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. What do you think?
Yeah, and when you look at the exploits of the 100th Bomb Group on D-Day, they flew dozens upon dozens of sorties, some crews going up 3 times.
Mhm.
And a lot of the men just spoke of this constant cycle where they were just living on coffee and chocolate bars. They'd go and fly a mission and come back, debrief, get a snack, be briefed again, get back in their plane, and do it again. And so it was an absolute whirlwind of a week. Now, to play devil's advocate, thinking cinematically here, would something like that become monotonous, especially considering the fact that the presence of the Luftwaffe was essentially non-existent
Mm.
on D-Day? Would it be exciting or compelling to just show bomb run after bomb run as troops are hitting the beaches? I don't know. We'll never know. But conversely, I can see perhaps why the filmmakers thought that wouldn't be compelling storyline.
Well, I know a guy. As a matter of fact, I think did I put? Yeah, I'm pretty sure I have his interview on this channel. I have an interview with a bombardier by the name of Ralph Goldsticker, who ran 2 missions on D-Day. He was a bombardier, and it's pretty fascinating hearing his story. Another fascinating element was with his story. He was part of the shuttle run to the Soviet Union,
Mm.
and landed in Poltava. And if I'm being picky, like I would have again pulled the Tuskegee Airmen backstory and saved it for another series for another day. And I probably would have again maybe expanded, had another 2 or 3 episodes, and I would have included that too.
That's a great point. Probably one of my favorite parts of Harry Crosby's book was his description of his time in the Soviet Union.
Yeah.
And what that experience was like. That could have been a whole episode in and of itself.
For people who aren't aware of that story, one of you
Go ahead,
tackle
Jared.
that.
You know it better than I do, I'm sure.
Yeah, I mean, he too was involved in these various shuttle missions, and it was rough going. Really, no other way to put it. But the interactions that he and his comrades had with Russian soldiers, Russian diplomats and interpreters, Russian women, food that they had never experienced before, and everywhere they were taken, it was like a party.
Mm.
And it would have been, I agree, a rather incredible depiction, but maybe depicting things in a positive light in Russia aren't in vogue these days for obvious
That's
reasons.
exactly
So,
what I was thinking. Was
yeah,
Crosby had it sounded like a very positive experience in his time in the Soviet Union, and
uh-huh,
I wonder how that would be sold right now.
Yeah, but
yeah,
still, I mean, it is what it is,
Yeah.
even with local things that are contemporary things that are going
yeah.
on. Um, what about your thoughts on the spy lady with that storyline?
That one was interesting for me because they took something that someone that Crosby did have an experience with, and I don't know that he ever explicitly says that he had a sexual relationship with her in the book, but it's heavily implied.
Mhm.
And yeah, he definitely implies that there was something going on, and he even describes how in a letter from his wife almost gave him permission for that, because she basically said, listen, the rules aren't the same in marriage in a situation like this because of war and everything.
Yeah.
But he also wrote the book after his wife had already passed away.
Yeah.
Yeah, it seems like they took a fictional character and molded the fictional character with the real life. Landra, I think, was her real name.
Mhm.
And I don't know. I went kind of back and forth with that.
Yeah,
Your
with
thoughts?
yeah, so they changed her name ever so slightly in real life. Her name was Wingate. In the show, they made her Westgate.
Yeah.
I'm not even sure why they did that. That's going to be an interesting question that I ask John Orloff when the time comes. Um, but I'll admit I really liked the Landra subplot because it shows us this other dimension of the American war, primarily being that it was this huge international affair.
Mhm.
And when I spoke to my friend John Homan, he said London and England as a whole, it was incredibly cosmopolitan and global.
Mm.
People from every corner of the globe, both men and women, were in uniform. And I really like how that dynamic was depicted. And interestingly enough, I'd say my favorite episode was an episode that didn't have any combat in it whatsoever. That was episode 6, where we kind of get a glimpse of Egan and the beginning of his prisoner of war experience, and all the while Crosby's in Oxford and London. I thought that was it was a very evocative episode, and so I for one really enjoyed it.
I think for me, I liked the initial episode, which I guess that would have been episode 3 or 4, where they introduce her character.
Hmm.
And then when she leaves, like I think if the audience was like me, they knew, oh, okay, this is a spy that he's dealing with. And then I felt like later on, like when they show her in France and everything like that, I thought it was getting into those later episodes where there's a whole lot going on,
Mm.
and I kind of wanted them to focus on some other things. Again, back to my Marvel Cinematic Universe example. What would be nice, it would be to have a little spin-off show with her, and kind of after she leaves, showing some of her exploits and some of the things that she accomplished. Do we know much about her, like what she did?
I don't think he said. I think he said he never had any contact with her again after the war, and that's one thing they changed a lot. Is the ending of their story together. They make it seem in Masters of the Air like basically she ended it, but in his book he said it was he actually went to her and told her it's done. We're not doing this anymore. So it didn't end up that way. But I don't think he ever had a contact with her after the war.
Okay.
And I searched high and low trying to find record of her. A bit harder to do that on this side of the pond, but I searched newspapers in the UK. That's where I found a whole lot of information on a lot of the characters depicted in the show. And I only found 1 or 2 references to that name, and I wasn't even 100% sure that it was her. So part of me wonders if Crosby even possibly changed her name.
Mm.
He gave her a pseudonym in case she was still alive, or she had kids that were alive and it didn't want to embarrass her, given the
That's an excellent
circumstances.
point.
So
We have somebody in the comments who has uncovered her identity. She became Queen Elizabeth.
yes. Well, she was very good at fixing vehicles.
Yeah,
it makes sense.
One other thing that I'll add, and then we'll move on to some other things. The only other thing, again, this is just me being exceptionally picky, that I would have added to the show, or that I would have liked to have seen. And maybe they didn't want to do this because it was too much like Band of Brothers, but that's adding some veteran interviews at the front end of the show. The documentary that they have at the very end, I thought was, I don't know if you guys saw it or not, but I thought it was phenomenal.
Yeah.
And to have those interviews with Rosie Rosenthal and Harry Crosby, I think you wouldn't even, to me anyway, you wouldn't have to have all 100 bomb group guys. I would have been happy seeing the testimony and experiences from anybody. I don't know, thoughts?
Yeah, and that's one nice thing too. Speaking specifically of Crosby and Rosenthal, there are a lot of videos of both of those guys on YouTube, not connected to Masters of the Air, but just in general. Like there's entire interviews with Crosby when his book came out in the early 90s talking. There's a lot of videos of Rosenthal at different events. They're really fascinating to listen to. And one thing more I'll say about Crosby just in general, I think because he was a college professor, and these college professor types, I think he had a way with words and a way of being able to describe it that makes, but he doesn't do so in such a way that's like too academic. It was just a really easy read. Like he did a great job of helping you to know what it was like and describing some of those missions and describing what the experience is like. It's one of my favorite World War II books that I've ever read was his book. Really, really well done the way he put it together.
Indeed.
Jared, were you getting ready to say something?
Oh yeah, about the interviews. Yes.
Yeah.
I can understand why they didn't, because they probably felt they didn't have enough to work with to go at the beginnings of all 9 episodes. They have enough for a companion documentary, but of course, the vast majority of these individuals are no longer alive.
Right.
And I mean, would we want to hear from the same 2 or 3 people at the beginning of every episode? So I, although it's disappointing, it's part of the process of time, and it's just victims of the passage of time.
Yeah.
All right, we'll move on from this, and again, I don't want this to come off as sounding negative in any way, because all 3 of us love the show. And one thing that I think is interesting is that most people, if people didn't like the show, everybody's entitled to their opinion. From what I've been able to see, like, people who really know their stuff and are like historians of the air war and things like that has largely been positive. Or, like, and I'm not counting myself in this. I don't count myself as, being anybody, but people who are really deep into this kind of stuff and are, World War II historians, the response has largely been positive. I haven't seen anything negative. So anyway, I'm curious, what were your favorite moments from the show?
Oh boy. Well, I would say, I don't know if this qualifies as a favorite, but I can certainly think of some very emotional moments in the show that resonated with me. In episode 3 during the Regensburg mission, that seems to be one of the hallmark moments of the show, just going from what other people have said and online chatter. But the scene where time is slowing down and there's just this massive influx of German fighters, and the death and devastation is inescapable, and you see people falling from planes without their chutes, and just all these nightmarish scenarios playing out. And that was an incredibly chilling and evocative moment in the series.
Yeah.
And it was just superbly well done.
Yeah, I would agree. That was probably, as far as like emotional impact, to me, the first couple episodes were kind of building to that. And man, that mission was a gut punch. To me.
There was a couple of things that immediately jump out at me. One of them, and I mentioned some of this on social media, was the episode where you have the ball turret gunner get stuck in his turret and he can't get out. I forget, was Bubbles? No, Babyface. Was that what they called him?
Yes, yeah, Babyface.
And I looked him up and found out he was from here. I live right outside of Youngstown, Ohio, and he was from Youngstown. So finding out that our local connection was that kid. And, obviously we don't know the exact details of what happened with that incident, but certainly was plausible the way that they portrayed it. But that was like, I always look for those personal connections where I can find them, and finding out that was our personal connection here was one thing. The part where Crosby gets back and reads the letter that was written to his wife when they thought he had been killed, but it was written by a guy who actually did end up getting killed, was, for me, that was one of the most emotional moments of it, and one that really, really grabbed me when I saw it.
I think for me, and I have no idea why this is, but this is a scene in the series that I have replayed in my head over and over and over. And really, it's kind of 2 that are connected. I guess it'd be episode 5 where they go on the Munster raid, and Rosenthal's plane is the only one left, and they're by themselves in the sky. Like that was a chilling moment for me. Beginning of the show, I thought that Harry Crosby was going to be the guy that I connected with and identified with. Man, to me, Rosenthal ended up being kind of the heart and soul
It's
of
exactly what happened with me. I started
I
with
agree.
Crosby and ended up connecting more with Rosie.
But
Yeah.
the one, it's a little moment, and the scene is probably, I don't know, most people may not even remember it. But in the next episode, you know, they have the episode where they go to the flak shack, and Rosenthal is kind of dissatisfied with being there. And there's a scene towards the end where he gets up to the B-17, and he's getting ready to go in, and he hesitates, and you can tell
Mm.
that he's been deeply affected by those first few missions, and he kind of takes a moment to collect himself, and then his fingers start drumming and tapping on the plane, and he's got Artie Shaw's the was it the chant?
The chant.
Yes, going through his head. And for some reason, that scene resonated with me,
Mhm.
where you have this guy who doesn't want to get back in, but finds a way to center himself and to make it happen.
Yeah.
Um, and then also, I probably the very last episode where they did the food drop with
Mhm.
Operation Chowhound. I mentioned Bud Hedicky. One of the reasons that scene really connected with me is he talked about that during his entire experience during the war, he was very conflicted about what he was doing. You know, every time he flipped that toggle switch, he knew that there were people not directly involved in the war who were dying at the other end. And
Mhm.
he was very unsettled about that. But he said he felt so fulfilled to be able to end the war by dropping food to people who were starving in Holland. But
It was a very emotionally satisfying scene.
yes, yes, very much. And I'm not really an emotional person at all, but man, at the end when they're taking off, and like the kids and the locals are watching them leave with a lot of sadness. That was another.
That was actually really that was a cool moment, because for just a moment there we get a glimpse of the fact that, I mean, think about that from the perspective of these British kids. All they had known for most of their lives was the war and all of these foreign people from allied countries that were there, and now suddenly the Americans who've based there for the last 4 or 5 years, now they're gone. And there was that kind of moment when they all took off, and now it's like, okay, now it's just us. That was
Yeah.
kind of cool.
Yeah. So I love the show. For people who may have not felt that connection watching it the first time through, I would encourage you to watch it again. I was having a conversation with my dad yesterday, and I asked him if he had finished Masters of the Air, and he said, yeah, as a matter of fact, we finished it, and then we went back to the very beginning and watched it the whole way through. And I said, how did you like it the second time around? And he said, I actually enjoyed it more. He said, because I had the context, and I actually knew who I was dealing with and looking at. He said, in my opinion, he said, I liked it better the second time around.
And I think the same thing happened to a lot of people who watched the Pacific.
Yes.
The Pacific goes to a darker place psychologically. I think a lot of people weren't prepared to handle that after seeing Band of Brothers. A Band of Brothers, for as brilliant as it is, I think in many ways it's a somewhat uncomplicated view
Right. Yeah.
of the war.
Yeah.
It still kind of taps into that Tom Brokaw-esque nostalgia
Yeah.
of the 1990s. And the Pacific goes in an entirely other direction. I think Masters of the Air finds a happy middle between the two, because there is an air of romanticism and glamour behind the Air Force, the jackets, the planes, the style, the Clark Gable mustaches, all sorts of fun stuff like that. While at the same time, it doesn't detach us from all of the emotional baggage that the war brings.
I think it also gives us a glimpse into how brutal the air war was,
Mm.
which I think has been a little bit glossed over. And I think a lot of veterans of the air war maybe struggled with that a little bit coming home, that people didn't understand
Yeah.
just what they had been through.
And my very first impression, and I realized that even with these actors, a lot of these actors, even though they appeared young, they were still older than the guys they were portraying. But the very first episode, my first instinct was, oh my gosh, how young these guys are. And maybe that's because I'm in my mid to late 40s now. And so I'm older than I was when I watched Band of Brothers, and those guys were my age. But that was a gut check right there, just thinking, man, these 18, 19, 20-year-olds being asked to do this.
Yeah, they did a really good job getting young guys.
Yeah, the casting was exceptional. Yeah.
All right, cool. So one last question. If Apple TV came to you and said, "Hey, we've got another $1 billion that we're going to spend on a series," what series are you making?
The Iron Brigade. Civil War. It'll never happen, but that's what I would do. Would be the Iron Brigade in the Civil War.
I think that would be awesome. We have a little bit of experience with, it's been a long time, but there have been a couple of Civil War series before with North and South and the Blue and the Gray.
The Blue and the Gray. I just went back and watched it recently. Man, it obviously it was made in the early 80s, and so it's got a bit of that to it, but it holds up pretty well. It's a good story. It really is.
So we're not confined to World War II?
No, it's whatever you want.
My first pick was going to be the Iron Brigade as well. When I worked at Gettysburg National Military Park, I spoke with my old boss, Scott Hartwig, premier Civil War historian, who's a really big fan of the Iron Brigade. And he even went so far as to write out a treatment. Like, he actually did an episode by episode plot outline.
Oh, that would be cool.
Nice.
Yeah, I mean, so like if Apple's listening, they should reach out to Scott Hartwig because he already has the blueprint.
I want to see that myself.
Yeah. But if we're thinking about World War II, I think you have to round out
the Navy.
You have to do the Navy. And so my thought is the USS Enterprise is the
That's exactly what I would say. Enterprise.
Yeah, because a ship that was there from the beginning to the end, and how incredible would it be? It just follow like a handful of crewmates throughout the entirety of the war in the Pacific. One can be a pilot, one can be a cook, one can be a gunner. You have this self-contained story on the high seas. It's a ready-made narrative, ready to go.
I've had a similar thought, except I have two great uncles who were both in the Navy. One was on a carrier. He was on the USS Bunker Hill, which got hit Battle of Okinawa, and the other one was on a destroyer named the USS Mulaney. And I thought, ooh, it'd be kind of cool to have a series of two brothers who each go on a different ship, and they're both kind of in the same area, and sometimes they go different places. It would be kind of neat to have a series like that as well. I had a couple thoughts. One would be some kind of World War I series. I think would be cool. I don't know what it looks like or who you would follow or anything like that.
Harlem Hellfighters. Long overdue for
that would be a
U.S. Doughboy.
Yeah.
Depiction.
I'd love to see the Harlem Hellfighters if we were going to do that.
Oh yeah, it's a good.
The other series that I thought, if I have like this magical scenario, would be something set during Reconstruction with Grant's fight against the KKK in the post-war South. I think that would make a cool series. But anyway, all right. So we've been at it a little over an hour. Any closing thoughts or anything?
The only thing I would say is I haven't gone back and watched the series a second time, but I've got a 10-hour flight to Rome next week. So that's what I'm going to be doing on that flight. I'm going to have the whole thing on my computer and watch the whole thing. And I'm going to be interested to see if my thoughts change. And a couple of people have commented, and I think maybe it would be a good idea. Maybe we should get together and do this again at the end of Manhunt. Because I've been actually planning on doing some stuff on Manhunt on my channel anyway. I'm enjoying it way more than I thought I would. I'll just say that about it. So
the only problem I have with Manhunt is I was kind of thinking and hoping that there would be some post-episode analysis on a certain channel. I won't name any names, but I'm still anxiously awaiting that.
It's coming via popular demand. And so we were burning it on both ends, getting Masters of the Air out in timely fashions. And so we're playing catch up just ever so slightly. But we will undoubtedly be taking a look at Manhunt
All
sometime
right.
in the foreseeable future.
Looking forward to it. Well, hey, thanks for taking the time to chat a little bit of movies and history this evening. Also, again, let me reiterate that in May, be looking for Into the Cold Blue by John Hoffman with Jared Frederick. Pre-order on Amazon, yes?
You can. It is available.
All right. Well, hey, you can pre-order it on Amazon. So if you're watching this, you know what to do. Also, a reminder that we had another episode of History Traveler this morning with an exploration.
It's really good too.
I watched it as well.
Oh, and I'll throw in that there's also a reaction video on Vlogging Through History that talks a lot about Sitting Bull that is really, really good. So those can kind of complement each other. So anyway, lots of stuff to check out on all three channels. So, all right, guys. Awesome. Well, thank you so much for joining us, and for everybody who was contributing to the chat and the sidebar, and who spent time to hang out with us tonight. Thanks.
Thank you.
All right.